Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to do this Seascape and colored pencil, and the surface is going to be toned paper primed with clear gesso. Let's go. So first I'm going to apply some clear gesso. One of the components of clear gesso is glue, PVA glue, and it can get stuck, I mean the lid. I'm gonna have to use a knife. There we go. That happens from time to time. Now I'm just going to give it a good stir. Now I'm going to apply this clear gesso with a soft synthetic brush, and I'm going to spread it out evenly. The layer doesn't have to be thick at all. I'll still get a lot of tooth. I just have to keep pushing it around so that I don't get any streaks, and so that it ends up being transparent, or mostly transparent. And it will be transparent when it dries. So time to start with a sketch. And in terms of the complexity of the sketch, with these landscapes, it can vary quite a bit, because sometimes I need to do a slightly more elaborate sketch. Sometimes I just draw a few lines. As always, the main idea is to work out the composition. Here I just drew the line of the water to the left, and then I'm going to sketch some shapes of these rocks to the right and in the center. I'm going to try to get their shape as close to what I want them to look like, but obviously there will be some modifications as I go along. So that's it for now, and I'm going to start with the sky. Now for the sky I'm going to start with a light phthalo blue. It's a lovely blue color that looks great for the sky. I want a slightly brighter sky with just a few traces of clouds here and there. And one of the things that you may notice as I'm working on this surface is how easily I'm covering this paper and how bright the color is. And that's because this rough textured surface grinds on the pencil and allows you to produce more vibrant colors and cover the paper a little bit more rapidly. And another thing that you can do is also blend it a bit better than you can on regular paper. But before I do that, here at the bottom or closer to the horizon, I just added a touch of light gray, cool light gray, and then I started blending. So I'm blending with my finger. And this is not really something you would do on regular paper, but when you prime the paper with clear gesso, it's easier to move that material, because the rough surface creates a lot of that dust from the pencil, and you can move that around, and you can also push it into the texture of the paper with your finger, so that it doesn't really need much fixing later. On top of that, I'm going to add some suggestions of some lighter clouds with a white colored pencil, and maybe soften it a little bit with a light cool gray pencil, just so that I wouldn't have too much texture and so that it wouldn't stand out too much. So just some suggestions of traces of clouds here in the distance, but I want the sky to be mostly very bright. And this is a light cool grey that I added on top, and this cooler grey goes well with the blue color of the sky. At the very top I added a touch of middle phthalo blue, which is a little bit darker, because I wanted to have a bit of a gradient from slightly darker blue to lighter blue at the bottom. So once that is done, I can start working on these rocks and the sea, of course, or the ocean, whatever it is. So some of these rocks are going to appear fairly dark, so I'm just going to do them with a black colored pencil. I know that they're mostly dark brown or something, but some of them are so dark that you can't really discern any details. So I'm just going to use a black colored pencil and simplify things a little bit, and maybe add a few touches of lighter color here and there as needed. Now another thing that I need to do before I start putting in the dark blue for the sea, for the water, is I want to draw some of these lighter details in the water, because we have a lot of these splashing waves and splashing foamy water around the rocks where the waves are kind of colliding or crashing against those rocks and the shore. So that's where I'm gonna have to use that white colored pencil. But the reason why I want to put in the white colored pencil first is because if I put the darker colored pencil like this Prussian blue, which is what I'm using for the water now, if I put that first and try to put the lighter pencil on top of that, it may get muddied a little bit, and I want to avoid that, especially with larger surfaces, with larger details. I can add a few dots here and there with a white colored pencil, and that's fine. But when I need to do larger waves, larger parts of foamy water, I want to put in the white colored pencil first, just to avoid that muddying and to make sure that these foamy white parts are really bright. So I'm moving on to these larger, taller rocks in the center, and I started with a black colored pencil and then a touch of brown colored pencil. This is a walnut brown, and then I'm gradually adding some lighter colors like raw umber and even burnt ochre. And the reason why I started with the black and the brown on the left is because that's the shadow side. So I suppose I should say a few words about the light source and the shadows. My light source is coming from above, as is the case in most landscapes, but it's also coming more from the right, which means that the right side is going to be the light side in the case of all of these rocks and objects in my scene. So you can see this clear contrast between the left side of that rock and the right side, which is the light side. The left side is much darker, and like I said, I used a black colored pencil for that. Now on top of this lighter side, where I used some lighter tones, I'm also adding a few touches of that brown and even black to create a little bit of unpredictable texture and maybe some suggestions of details, and just to suggest to the viewer that this is an uneven surface, like it's a rocky, rough surface. Moving on to the other large rock here, again starting with the shadow side here. I want to divide the shadow area and the lighter area first to establish that larger contrast first, and then maybe I can play around a little bit and add a few details here and there, because it is always these larger contrasts that are more important if you want to explain the shapes to the viewer. So you can see how I'm going from one larger shadow area to another, and putting in those darker values first. There's a nice large shadow here on this taller rock here in in the foreground. It's not really the foreground, but it's kind of a midground, but it's closer than the other two, obviously. And you can see, even while I'm drawing these larger shadow areas, I'm drawing kind of slightly interrupted shapes, leaving just a few lighter areas here and there, almost randomly, because I want a little bit of variation even in that shadow side, because the shadow side is not going to be completely dark, because we're talking about a very rough, uneven surface. So in that rough, uneven surface, some of these rocks are going to be jutting out a little bit more, maybe, and maybe they're going to be catching a bit of light from the light source, so they're kind of sticking out of that shadow and catching some light, which is why they have to be lighter. And that's why I like to add a little bit of variation to the shadow areas. Just leave a few random areas a little bit lighter. And here I'm kind of further defining the shape of this, the side of this rock, by adding some more shadows under these smaller shapes. And even though this looks a little bit complex, and it's going to end up looking fairly realistic, the reason why it ends up looking realistic is because you're always aware of the light source. That's one of the things about these detailed realistic landscapes, is that they can look a little bit daunting to beginners, but once you understand that all you have to be aware of are the basics, the contrasts in value, the contrast between the light side and the shadow side, the general awareness of the light source whenever you draw any shape. As long as you have these things in mind, everything you draw will look pretty realistic, and it will make sense to the viewer, even if the viewer doesn't really know that much about drawing. So as long as you're consistent with the light source and all of your shadows are kind of on one side of each and every one of these objects, whether they are smaller objects or larger objects, it'll make sense to the viewer. So what I'm trying to do is make sure that all of these shadows are kind of on the right side of each and every one of those shapes, and down, because all of these shapes are casting a shadow down and to the right because of the positioning of the light source. Here I'm also adding some greenish colors to the top of this rock here, like maybe there's a little bit of grass or moss or whatever on top of one of these rocks. I'm not going to draw any trees, it's just going to be a rocky shore, but I'm going to add some touches of green here, and I'm not going to use only one green. I used a little bit of May green here, but on top of that I'm using some slightly darker green. This I think is I don't know, I think it was maybe permanent olive green, and then on top of that I'm even going to use a little bit of black colored pencil just to add a little bit of random texture and some shadows here and there to stay consistent with the light source and the overall shape and the nature of the terrain, which is fairly rough. As a final touch around the top of those cliffs or rocks, I cleaned the edges up a little bit by going around them a little bit with a blue colored pencil. And now I'm just finishing the bottom part of those rocks. So once I'm happy with the way the rocks look, I need to put in a few more of those lighter areas with a white colored pencil. And obviously, as I've already explained, I'm doing that because it's easier for me to put in the lighter details first, so that I wouldn't have to draw these on top of the darker areas. Now I have to tell you, this textured surface, a clear gesso, which is similar to sanded paper, allows you to put in a few more layers, and it allows you to put lighter details on top of the darker ones. But there are limitations to that. So you don't want to rely on that too much, because there will always be some muddying, especially when you're drawing larger areas. So when you have the opportunity to block in those lighter values first, why not do it? You just put those lighter areas in place, and then you can work on those darker areas, and then maybe you can put in some lighter details on top as a finishing touch, because that is what this surface will allow you to do. You couldn't do that on regular paper, but I feel like even though this surface is superior to the regular paper in terms of the amount of details that you can put in and in terms of layering, you still want to work from light to dark whenever possible, and then maybe add some lighter details on top of the darker areas when you have to, and when you feel like that'll enhance the overall appearance of your drawing. So that's the approach I took here. I first put in the lighter foamy areas to represent those crashing waves and the foamy water around the rocks and around the crests of those waves, because the waves, when they crash into one another, the water is going to be foaming a little bit. There's going to be some of these lighter areas, and I put in those first, and then I put in some darker blue areas. And these darker blue areas, I put those in with Prussian blue, which is a lot darker than what I used for the sky. But here and there I even used a little bit of that light phthalo blue on the water to break up the monotony and to add some suggestions of smaller ripples and waves. Now here on this larger wave that is crashing on the shore, I added a touch of green because I wanted some greenish colors as well. And then I kind of layered over that with some Prussian blue and some lighter phthalo blue, and I think I achieved not only a very nice shape of the wave, but also a nice looking color of that wave, so that it looks more realistic as it's kind of washing out on the shore, and it's almost transparent and in one area. So I added some small details to it, and then I moved on to the rest of the water here, and you can see that here the waves are kind of stacked one behind the other, where we have the ones which are closer to us kind of receding already, and the new ones are coming up on the shore. And in addition to that, we're also going to have an area of wet sand where there are no waves, but there's still a little bit of water and just a wet sand, which is kind of a reflective surface. And there we're going to draw some reflections, so that's going to be interesting. I did a bit of blending with a brush to soften some of the textures which I didn't like. But don't worry, I'm going to add some lighter details on top of that, because like I said, I can do that on this surface. So right now, I'm adding a touch of brown to this part of the beach here, and this is where that area of wet sand is going to end. And for that wet sand, I need to find a way to create contrast between between the water and the wet sand. I need to make it clear to the viewer where one ends and the other one begins. So I'm going to use slightly different colors and slightly different textures and details, obviously. So here I'm adding some reflections to put in some darker details to match the image above the water, because like I said, this wet sand, which maybe has a little bit of water, a tiny layer of water on top of it still, it's going to be reflecting the image above, not exactly like a mirror. It's going to be a blurred, slightly distorted image. That is why you don't have to worry about making the reflection look perfect. What you have to make sure is that the placement of the darker values and lighter values in your reflection roughly matches the image above the water. As long as you can get that to look right, and you distort the image a little bit with these horizontal ripples and kind of smudge it a bit, blur it a little bit, because obviously in the reflection you want less texture and less detail, it'll look fine. But like I said, the key thing is making sure that these darker areas, that these shadow areas are roughly in the same place as they are in the image above the water. And another thing I did with this area of wet sand to the right at the bottom, I added a little bit more gray. So I want that part to be more grayish so that it looks a bit different from the actual water. And I also added some suggestions of the movement of water and some shadow under some of these waves, and a few lines that would maybe be created in the sand from that movement of water. And then I just went over it a little bit with a brush to soften it, because like I said, I want to avoid having too much texture there. I want this part of the drawing to look smoother, less defined. And then I added some lighter details on these waves, maybe a few ripples here and there, maybe a few splashes here and there, and just tried to make the overall appearance of water and the foamy water and those waves a little more complex and a little more realistic. So after that, all I have left to do is work on this, the rest of the beach and a little bit of this reflection here. And there's also a smaller group of rocks here all the way to the right. So that's another thing that I have to finish. But right now, as you can see, I'm kind of refining the appearance of that reflection as well as the sand at the bottom part of the drawing. So here in the middle to the right, there's just a few smaller rocks here. So I'm going to use the same approach, just draw some shadow under them and then add a little bit of texture and some other colors on top. And the good thing about clear gesso is that you can prime any paper with it, and you can use toned paper. Here I used sand colored paper, which is useful to me because I use that background color for the rocks, for the beach and stuff like that. You can pick any color you like. Of course, you can first prime the color with watercolor or acrylics, and then you can use clear gesso on top of that. And the paper I used was Fabriano toned paper, sand-colored paper. And the clear gesso I used was the Winsor & Newton clear gesso. The pencils I'm using, I don't know if I mentioned that, are Faber Castell Polychromos colored pencils, but if you've been watching my videos, you already know that, because I use these materials in many of my videos. So I'm just putting down some finishing touches on this reflection here. I think it looks good. It doesn't have to be perfect. And just removing the tape from these corners and finishing my drawing, putting down some finishing touches to the sky and cleaning up some of the edges, adding some final details because the drawing is almost done. And now I'm just going to put my signature in the lower right corner, and that's it. That's a lovely little seascape in colored pencil. I hope you like it. Don't forget to subscribe, give me a like, comment on my videos, and if you want to see longer videos and more content, you should check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.